It is such a delight for me to be here with you. I am absolutely crazy about your pastor and his wife. And so just being with them is worth a trip to Hawaii as far as I'm concerned. But to be with you, as they say, icing on the cake. I just want to say something about your worship team. I get around, and I've been getting around for a long time. I first entered, that wasn't that funny, was it? I first interfaced with Calvary Chapel really at its beginnings way back in 1969 and thereabouts, and it was at the height of the Jesus movement. And I was totally enraptured because my church history had been, very Pentecostal. My parents were Pentecostal pastors, and I grew up in that church. And I don't know why, there was always a little dissonance in my heart. And when I discovered what God was doing in what we call the Jesus movement, where the choir had been taken down off of the platform and the crowd was now the choir, and the songs they sang were the songs that would stay in the hearts of that crowd all week long. And they were songs of devotion, You just wanted to love God by singing them. And I loved that. And they were memorable. And there was no manipulation, look, if you only raise your hands this much, that's like a flag flying at half-mast means there's somebody, And I'd have to go through that. But none of that went on with our revival. It was very relaxed, and the close, even some of our pastors preach in shorts, some of the best-known ones do. I don't preach in shorts because it would be distracting. You ain't seen ugly legs yet. But I so loved what was happening, and the Bible was being just simply taught, And I identified with that very rapidly, found myself not as welcome in my denomination as I had been before, and that was okay with me. And it was a very easy thing for me to gradually, actually fairly rapidly, move most of my ministry over into the great series of Calvary Chapels that came. Now, I'm telling you this, and I'm really talking about your worship team. I so love coming here because of the worship that you have. It comes so close to what I first fell in love with when I interfaced with Calvary Chapel. I hate to tell you this, but something is happening, and it troubles me so deeply, I'm going to make a critique of it and go public, but you're going to hear it first. I don't know if you've heard of a man whose last name is Spector. He is an evil man. Finally, they got him. He's in prison for murdering his mistress. He was a musical man, he invented a thing called the wall of sound. I can't believe how many worship groups have adopted the wall of sound. Now here, you hear the words, and you hear the melody, and there isn't this loud wall of sound behind going on that if the person's singing, it doesn't sing, you weren't hearing him anyway, it didn't matter. And they're singing songs that aren't going to live with me at all. Never heard them before, can't remember them, and it just troubles me. I watch congregations, whatever age they are, during worship. And if you're really worshiping, I know it's working. But what I see is they will make you stand for the entire time and nobody sing. And I'm thinking, something's wrong here, So that's one reason I love to come here. Keep doing what you're doing. Everybody, and I mean everybody, everywhere, at some point wants to know, well, regardless of your age, or background. Everybody, everywhere, at some point wants to know, what is God like? You know what I've discussed? I've had some interesting discussions with atheists. Even they want to know what God is like. It really is like, we know you're not there, so why don't you go away and leave us alone, kind of thing. Well, the thing is, folks, we do know what God is like. Now, this isn't arrogance on our part. It's sheer grace and mercy on God's part. But we know what He's like. He's like Jesus. This is pretty clear in Scripture. Hebrews begins with this awesome statement. By the way, I'm going to be using several versions of the Bible this morning, so don't get upset. If you don't like one, don't listen. But in one of the newer ones, it says at the beginning of Hebrews, in the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at various times and ways, but in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son, whom He appointed heir of all things, and that's quite a few, and through whom He made the universe. I love this. We're spending billions of dollars right here in Hawaii trying to see, can we see where the end of it is out there, And when we discover where the end of it is, what are we going to do with it? We're going to announce that we saw it. Oh, well, all right, big deal. But Jesus made that, through whom He made the universe. And it says the Son, Jesus, is the radiance of His glory. In other words, it is the outflow of His glory. Now, I don't have time to do the nature of the Father, so you'll know what the glory is. And the exact, and you don't get much closer than exact, representation of His being. So when you see Jesus, you know exactly what God is like, upholding all things by His powerful word. I like that. Jesus Himself says, when you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I and the Father are one. Paul also tells us, in Him was the fullness of the Godhead bodily. Now that's the King Jimmy version. But it says simply that God put everything He was in Jesus. So to me, that's pretty clear. So if you want to know what God is like, study Jesus. Well, now the question is, what is Jesus like? We've messed with Him quite a bit through the centuries. We've added all kinds of crazy stuff, There are people who actually believe that Jesus glowed in the dark, Well, I mean, you see the paintings, But logic, sheer logic, folks, if Jesus had glowed in the dark, Judas would not have had to kiss Him to identify Him. Get the one you can see, Others think that He was about, 8 feet tall, He was the one who could say, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I won't fear any evil, because I'm the biggest thing in the valley, Well, actually, folks, He was, this is a guess, but it's a good guess, and there's logic to it, about 5 feet 6 inches tall. That was the average male height back then. Had He been even 6 feet, Judas would not have had to kiss Him to identify Him. He'd just say, get the big one. And there are a lot of people who think His voice was different, When we greet each other, hi, good to see you, glad you're here this morning. But we think that when Jesus spoke, there was an electronic echo in His voice. And the Philadelphia Symphony Orchestra was playing in the background. Listen, if that had been true, Judas wouldn't have had to kiss Him to identify Him. Just say, when you hear the orchestra, that's Him. And there's one other thing, too, and I'll just say it now because I won't really have time to dwell on it later. But every picture you see painted of Jesus, ain't He pretty? Most beautiful red-headed Irishman I've ever seen. I grew up, in fact, I carried it in my wallet for years. It meant something to me, and I appreciated it. But it was a Solomon head of Christ thing with this young boy that I identified with, who was steering this boat, big boat, in a horrible storm, And there was Jesus just behind with his hand on his shoulder, telling him where to go. Ooh, I get teary just thinking about it, you know. But that's not how Jesus looked. We don't really know, except he was so calm that Judas couldn't describe him. I'm going to have to point him out. I'll kiss him and then you'll know. You know. I can't describe the guy. He was, but you see, there's real logic and reason for this, because this is part of his making himself of no reputation, which I will talk about later in the day, possibly in our last hour. And the reason he did that, he didn't make himself of bad reputation, but of no reputation, so that everyone, no matter who, would feel comfortable coming to him. But at any rate, there's even more things we know. I like Christmas, I really do. But there are a few things even about Christmas, you know. When we put our manger scenes out on our lawn, if you do that, we make them out of wood and as comfortable as they can possibly be, you know, and well-behaved people. It wasn't really that way. Those of you who've been with Israel with me, you know that on our second day there, I show you what that manger would have looked like when we were in Megiddo, and we're looking at a place where they fed animals, and it's stone. They laid him in this stone thing, you know. And, you know, one of the things about Mary that we kind of get wrong, you get a clue of it in the Magnificat, it's called, or Mary's song, when she makes a statement, "You have removed my shame." What might her shame have been? Well, I think part of it is the fact that she was probably at an age we would call old maid now. They married them young back then, and she was a little past that. And apparently the only husband willing to claim her was a bit older than her. Some of the things it says about Joseph, you really don't tend to say about young men, you know. We're still working on it at that point. And so all of these things kind of mislead us in a sense. And the star even. We have in Southern California a world-class what do they call them? You know, where they project the stars on the, what? Observatory kind of thing, yeah. Whatever. Planetarium, yeah. And they, you know, they can do this. They can put the stars in reverse. You know, they figured this all out. Amazing. And they go back to about where Jesus was, and they said, "There, that's the star." That's right. I'm looking at it and I'm saying, that would never guide some guys all the way across the desert and then come and point right there at the place. If any star got that close, we'd be crispy critters, you know that. It was a special star, you know. It led them, and then finally it had a finger. Is it right here, guys? Right here, you know. So there are all kinds of things that will keep us from really knowing what he was like. Many people think that he was born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He's a good American boy, you know. There's even a pastor in Beaumont, Texas. Now, I can believe it about Texas. They call him the pistol-packing parson. And he encourages all of his people to wear guns when they come to church. Because if Jesus were here, he'd wear guns. He'd clean some things out, let me tell you. You know what I'm thinking. What Bible do you read? You know? Well, anyway, if that's not the way he is, then how are we going to know what he is like? Well, to our great advantage, he tells us. And he tells us in response to a certain very common apostolic activity. We have some new characters in our story. When I say the word apostle, what pops into your mind? Can you see these tall, handsome men with deep bass voices who walked in unison with Jesus everywhere he went. That is not the way they were. Folks, if you really honestly, see, we study it through pink glasses or something. But if you study it honestly, you can only come to one conclusion about the apostles. They were world-class jerks. They were turkeys. They were so useless to Jesus, it was embarrassing. He was constantly covering for them, putting ears back on heads and things like that. Now, if you read it honestly, you can only come to one conclusion. The most common apostolic activity recorded in the Gospels was arguing. Not over deep theological questions, like the solution to free agency plus or predestination. No. They argued constantly from the beginning right down to the end at the Last Supper over who's the greatest. I'm better than you. You are not. Yes, I am. Now, this was a pretty much daily argument. How do I know? Well, here's the thing that I'll help you with a bit here. The tables, they don't sit at tables like we do. We got tables set out there. They didn't sit at chairs and tables like we do. They had low tables, and they reclined around them so that their legs were sticking out from the table like the spokes of a wheel. But what people don't tend to know about that table is when there was a crowd there and a host, they would seat themselves according to rank. Now that changes everything, doesn't it? I mean, if you've ever been a child, or if you've had multiple children, you know there are petty arguments like that among siblings, about who sits where. You sat there last time. It's my turn today. You always get it. We are so human. So were the apostles. And it was a daily argument. Every time they sat down to eat, there'd be the argument over who sits where. Isn't that amazing? See, don't normally think about that, but when you discover a little bit about it, you realize why they argued all the time. Now, why would they argue? Surely Jesus would seat them. No, he didn't care where they sat. He was observing these guys. He just gave him all kinds of teaching opportunities because he was so patient with them. It really amazes me. And sure enough, when they argued over who was the greatest, Jesus would patiently teach them. And here's where we really begin our story now. You don't have to turn here, but write this down. Matthew chapter 18. And there, they had been walking along the path, and when they had come to Jerusalem, and were in the house, Jesus asked them, over here? Okay. Thank you. What were you guys fighting about while you were on the way? See, they must have been walking behind Jesus out of earshot, because they didn't want him to hear this. What were you guys fighting about while you were walking along the way? They didn't want to tell him, well, it's private, Jesus. You don't need to know. I can hear Jesus saying, you're right, guys. I don't need to know. But I tell you what, let me give you a teaching, okay? Okay, you're the boss. Let me tell you who the greatest in the kingdom is. You told. I didn't tell him. No. I think Peter, and this is kind of obvious too, probably started the whole argument anyway. And when Jesus said, let me tell you who the greatest in the kingdom is, he probably folded his arms and thought, good, I'd rather they hear it from him. I love these guys. They were just so human. Now, why didn't he pick elite people? Why didn't he go to the theological seminaries and get some fellows that knew all of the various problems that come with the different theological approaches that you have and so on? It used to be when I would go to Germany, and I had a really good translator, but he was a bit of a problem because he was a graduate of a theological seminary. And I would make some statements, and he had to, and then find, yeah, okay, and then he would he would translate it, you know. I wanted him to say, just translate and learn, you know. But why would he not choose that kind? Why wouldn't he choose the more intellectual? Last Sunday, I was in Los Alamos, New Mexico. What's so big about Los Alamos? That town has more PhDs per capita than any town in the world. That's where they invented the atomic bomb, you know, and they still have a massive, I don't know what they're inventing now. I don't want to ask, because if they tell me, they probably have to kill me. You know? But, I mean, the church was filled. You just looked at him and you knew he knows things. But why didn't Jesus pick that kind? Well, I had a question and answer session with him, and I realized they may be brilliant, but they are dumb when it comes to the things of the Lord. You know, they're asking questions like, okay, I'll answer that, but dear me. Yeah. And why did Jesus pick these guys off the streets? You know, back in that day, all education was religious education anyway. You studied the Torah, and if you were sharp, you went a little higher, and if you were sharper, you went higher. If you weren't, they'd say, go get a job. Where did Jesus get his guys? They had jobs. They were the D students. That's why we call them the disciples. So anyway, I'm convinced, folks, and I think this is supportable, because when you look through the Scripture, who God deals with and who He blesses and who He uses, they're pretty low on the totem pole. You know, He didn't pick the Jews because they were nice, and they have remained pickable through the years. You know, no, they're stiff-necked and hard-hearted people. They've always been that way. I think Jesus picked the apostles just to show who He could work with. Now, this should encourage us, because I think He's saying we're all apostolic quality. Really? Now, don't get all puffed up about that, because when you know what they were really like, you're going, oh, I don't know, you know. Could I be something else? And He picked the Jews, I believe, to show who He could work with, not because they were nice. I do have a crazy theory about it. I do believe that when Jesus walked in Israel and healed people, He didn't heal symptoms. See, you can buy medicine that will deal with your symptoms but won't really heal you. But I think when Jesus made people whole, He even corrected their DNA. Wow. Now that took some doing in people like me, you know. Which means then that they became complete human beings once again. And through the centuries, that gets all messed up, you know, and what have you. But even today, there are more Nobel Prize winners and other major scientific prize winners. We owe our electric lights really not to Edison, but we owe them to a guy named Tesla, a Jewish guy, you know. And there have been more of them win major scientific awards and change the world than all other races combined. Why? I think what happens is through the years there is a stream that boom, it comes out, and a brilliant and you know, the thing that fascinates me is that most of those brilliant guys had horrible bodies. You know, you would never look at him and think he's going to change the world. You know, you just hope he can change himself. You know, but it's just a crazy theory that I had. You know. Anyway, when Jesus began to teach the apostles about who was greatest in the kingdom, He was teaching about Himself. because he was greatest in the kingdom. And when you look at what happened, I'm writing some of this down right now because I've found a need for it. The book, The Jesus Style, out on my table is the most important thing out there. And if there's one book you get, and because you've only got $5 or that's all you care to spare, even though it is a great price, normally 10 to 13 plus tax, but don't worry about that. But if there's only one book you get, please get The Jesus Style. In fact, we're in the process, and you can pray with me about this, and if you're really rich, you can help. But I've had a vision of sending a copy of that book to every church in the nation. And it's decades old vision. And I wondered, God, it's yours, so I don't know what to do. I'm not going to start, doing the money-raising sort of thing. But it has begun to happen. And it's an expensive thing, but we already sent a copy of it to every church in New England, all of those states. We've sent a copy to every church in Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Arizona, Washington State, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the St. Louis area. But we've got a long ways to go. But we're getting some very interesting responses to it. The reason I'm doing this is because it does have a track record of whole churches being totally changed. One big Mennonite church up in Canada was tearing itself apart until the brother of the pastor gave him a copy of the Jesus Style and said, you need to have all of your leaders read this. And it so healed the church that they invited me to come up and speak. I had a Nazarene guy sit down by me at a memorial service and ask me, are you Gayle Erwin? I said, is this a subpoena? I said, yeah. He said, you wrote the Jesus Style. Yes, I did. He said, you don't know me, but I pastor a very large Nazarene church in the town next to this one. And he said, you would not recognize my church now if you saw us just 3 years ago. But I had all of my people read the Jesus Style, and it has turned us into a church finally, And that kind of thing is happening, and happening worldwide, There was a village where a Gospel for Asia evangelist went to preach. They stopped him, some thugs did, at the city limits kind of thing. And villages there can be like 25,000 people, And they beat him up and burned his materials. Except for one thing, a copy of the Jesus Style. And a couple of years later, this same evangelist says, I got to go back to that town. And of course, the guys met him at the city limits and found out who he was, and they said, come with us. And they took him right straight to the mayor or leader, and he had that copy. He said, we burned everything but this. And he said, is this the way your God is? And they said, yes. Then we as a whole town will believe in him. And that is a Christian village now. So that kind of influence, I want to take the chance, no matter what it costs. I've got to take the chance that just getting them in the hands of churches or pastors, and we address them not to the pastor but the church secretary, because we know pastors are basically illiterate. And they're going to hand it to someone else, say, read this for me, So we're going to get it to them first. And they'll say, hey, you got to read this. Anyway, I'm just throwing that in. So Jesus, as he begins to teach what I call the nature of Jesus. Do you know what I was going to name my book first? This would really get you. The incarnation principle. One of my students, bless his heart, we buried him just the other day, said, why don't you call it the Jesus Style? Okay. So you see, I don't come up with stuff. I just surround myself with guys. He was my best student, but he was not my best academic student. He would ask a question in class and go to sleep while I answered it. But I loved the dude. I mean, he got the message, and he lived a life out of servanthood, you know. And so, oh, I miss him. So Jesus, as he responds to the guy, says, whoever wants to be great, let him be your servant. Wow. Slave is another word for that. Isn't this exciting? Yeah, I know. You're probably thinking, I gave up. Well, I'm only going to be here an hour, I guess, anyway. You know, gave up Saturday morning to hear this. I think I'll go home now. I know this isn't exciting, and so let me give you some definitions first that might be of some value to you. The first one is, a servant is someone who makes life better for someone else. Isn't that simple? I really only know simple things. I was telling the guys last night, I tried something complicated once, but it still flashes 12 noon at me all the time. I have to depend on my grandkids. They know this stuff. That's so simple, though. Just make life better for someone else. Another one is that a servant is a freedom agent. He provides freedom for other people. When you stop and think about this, you know, we had precious people who have put together food and coffee and stuff like that out there. They get so little honor for that, except in heaven, you know, because they provide freedom for us. We don't have to go running around somewhere looking for food that'll kill us. They got stuff that'll make us feel good. It doesn't kill us there. I know. I'm still here. And in heaven's eyes, you know, they've made life easier for you. And they did this without any reward except the joy of doing it for you, you see. So heaven has a little bit different hierarchy than we do here in the earth. So my other one, but this one is my working definition. A servant is someone who is others-centered. Others-centered. Isn't that rather obvious? As opposed to even, and especially different from, self-centered. Now, I have to confess to you something, and I'm sorry about this. I don't like to, but I have to. You're looking at a very self-centered man. I'm sorry. I think about myself most of the time. In fact, I think you think about me most of the time. Right? Well, you should. Now, you're going to be thinking about this. I'm laying some stuff down that's going to force you to think about it. I can promise you that when you think about yourself, it does not produce anything but misery for you, because yourself is never satisfied. You know? No one ever treats you just as well as you think you deserve or ought to be treated. It's the nature of us. We're born self-centered. And it sticks there until it's natural, something supernatural begins to change it for you. Just the way we are. Now, I have read some really wise and great men who were listened to by other people say, you know, that's a real problem with we human beings, and they will come around with trying to get us to think of others more, you know, and people will say, oh, that was wonderful. And then they go out and they don't do it, you know, because, I've got to tell you this. I once presented this to a group of 20 psychiatrists in Southern California. I had gone public with a theory of therapy. That was back when that was a big word, you know. So I took a theory of therapy right out of the Bible and went public with it. And it caused these guys to ask me to present this to them because they could see some results of it. And so I'll never forget when I stood in front of these 20 psychiatrists. And ran through this in 1 hour. Now, I'm not letting you get away with that. And when I finished, I said, this is then the picture of complete therapy and perfect health. And I said, what do you think? And it was only a few seconds of silence when the guy who seemed to be their spokesman said, it's perfect. I said, thank you. But then in a moment of great honesty, he said, but we can't do it. I said, I know. He admitted that this takes some kind of spiritual event in a person's life to do. And we cannot do that. I said, that's right. But I thought, if it's perfect, why not go ahead? Get saved, guys, and do this with people. Teach them this. I mean, it would have been logical, wouldn't it? It's perfect, but I don't think we can do it. We're not going to do it. Yes, you can, but it'll take, first of all, a spiritual event in your life. Well, anyway. Now, the thing about servanthood, too, is that if you stop and think, do you realize that every single part of your body is a slave to the rest of your body? Every single part. This ear cannot travel out on its own and say, I'm tired of listening from this side. I think I'm going to listen from the top. No. It was created, and when it's doing its job right, every single part, and this thing's made up of trillions of little bits of stuff. Nice ear, that's kind of loose there. But when every part of your body is doing what it was created to do in servanthood, because every part's a servant, that's all it is, you're in perfect health. Really? You never have to eat broccoli again. You never have to take pills. You take those to see if you can't get it to serve. Simple as that. Perfect health is simple servanthood. I have never there are times, and this troubles me, but then it's part of the problem of being churches as we are, because the original churches were just gatherings of homes and so forth. But when we institutionalize a bit more, and we have to have a building and things like this and own things and so forth, there comes points in every church I've ever visited, and I don't think you know this word, so forget it right after I say it, where people have split, They call them church splits, which is, it's irrational. It's an oxymoron. If it's a church, it ain't splitting. I've never heard one split because they were having an argument over who got to be slave. It's always over who gets to be in charge, who calls the shots, who tells you what to do here, who has the power. Oh, are we into power? Politicians are, but I know you don't think so. But never over, I just want to serve, man. Can I be a slave? Can I help people out? We never split over that. By the way, it is possible for one part of your body to begin to serve only itself. It happens. It happens. Doctors have a name for it. They call it cancer. That is the definition of cancer. When one part of your body begins to serve only itself. Deadly. And we go to any length to deal with it. Now, I've had a number of physicians in my services. One of them is just a lifelong friend. He was a surgeon. And I had a lot of fun out of him when he showed up at a conference with his hand bandaged up. And I said, what happened? He said, I cut myself in the kitchen working on some food. I said, you're my surgeon. But he told me, he said, you're absolutely right. That is exactly what makes cancer different from everything else, because it serves only itself. Wow. Quite an argument, I think, for servanthood. But then Jesus says in Matthew chapter 20, beginning with verse 20, and I love this, it was in response to one of these apostolic underhanded tricks. James and John had at least heard Jesus saying that it's all just about over, guys, and they began to panic, I think, and they said, "Oh man, we need to hurry up and get our position solidified. We need a contact. We need a lobbyist." Mama? Yes, boys, what do you want? You know, Jesus really likes you, and you know, I think if you could just put in a good word for us, you know, I think he knows that we're the top dudes, but he's a great Messiah, but he's a terrible organizer. He can't seem to get this thing organized. But he knows we're the top ones. If you just go and ask if we'd be the number one, number two guys, I mean, I think he'd do it. Okay, boys, I'll be glad to. This is one of my favorite events in Scripture because there's just so much hypocrisy going on here. And she goes and she kneels down. I don't think she normally knelt down when she came to Jesus, but I think Jesus looked at that and thought, "What's up?" You know? And she says, "Jesus, it's my boys, all right? They're good boys." Now, they're standing behind her, you know, pretending they don't know what's going on. Could you make one of them your president and the other your vice president in your coming kingdom? And I think the boys went, "Mama, what are you doing?" And Jesus looked at them because he knew where it was coming from. He said, "You don't know what you asked. Can you be baptized with the baptism I'm going to be baptized with?" Now that's talking about suffering. "Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink?" That always meant death in the ancient world. And now for the first time we hear the guys, "We can." They really didn't know what they were asking for. And I think Jesus smiled at them and had a twinkle in his eyes and he says, "Okay, you will." But the positions, I'm sorry guys, but I'm not the one that gives those. They're thinking, why didn't we go over his head? I knew we should go over his head. See, right from there. And then he says to them, when the other guys found out about it, started another apostolic argument, Jesus called them together and said, "The rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them." And that's true, isn't it? Work is that way. I was just reading something, it was a survey and stuff that they did that some of the most successful bosses are jerks. You know, we think, well, wouldn't it be nice to have a good boss, but he won't make you work enough. You get a jerk and he drives you crazy, but you work harder and the thing works a lot more money. Isn't it great? So you probably work for jerks, unless you're on the staff here. But that's the way this world is. And Jesus says they lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. And then he says, "Not so with you." Well, how are we going to lead if we can't beat them up a bit, if we can't order them around all the time and show who's boss? How are we going to lead? Well, except we know this. We're not going to lord it over. He says, but instead, whoever wants to be great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever wants to be first, and we all want to be great. We do. In our own way. It's just the human nature. And we all want to be first. My junior high school football team that I played, well, I didn't really ever play football. It mostly was played on me, you know. But I was fullback, first string fullback. Don't pay attention to the fact that we lost every game, but not a single time did I hear our coach say, "Now guys, I want you to get out there and throw this game, man. We want to have a perfect lost season." Remember when Detroit lost every game in the professional league? I think that had never happened before. But I watched one of their games, and a guy actually scored a touchdown. And he ran through the end zone. Number one. I think that meant that was his first one. But we all want to be number one. It's the natural us. And hear this, Jesus never put that down. He never said you shouldn't want to be number one. But what he did say is the way you think you get there is not the way you get there. But the way you get to number one is by being a servant to everyone. Being other-centered, thinking, I want to make life better for you. If I ever figure out how, I'll do it, or if you know how I can, I just want to be a servant to you. When my wife travels with me, and old age has hit her a little harder than it's hit me, though it has hit me hard enough, And I have to tell you, too, I played football before they had face masks, so that explains a lot of things, too. Now you're going to be thinking about the wrong stuff now. But when she's got to the point she can't make long trips like this with me and so forth, and I'm sorrowful for that because I love to have her with me. But she would usually stay in a lobby or somewhere where my books and tapes were tapes. Remember those? Would you believe I first started recording things on a wire recorder? Now, you don't even remember that, do you? Yeah, young whippersnapper. Were there airplanes there? Well, there were these things that made noise. And she watches, and she can discern the health of a church by what she sees in the lobby. Sometimes it will move her so much that she'll cry when she would see servanthood going on and people being loved and confused people coming in and being taken by just not necessarily people who are supposed to do it, but they would just take them and say, hey, I'll help you get around. You're going to love it here and so forth. And then sometimes she'll watch things happen that will also make her cry. And she said, I couldn't believe how they mistreated people. But we're to be servants. It's all there is to it. And the main reason is because that's what Jesus was. And if we ever sing the song to be like Jesus, you just need to know what you're praying for. Yeah, but if I'm always blessing other people, who's going to bless me? He that tooteth not his own horn, the same shall not be tooted. You know that, don't you? That's a trick of the devil to get us to think, you don't think this is where it's at, do you? You're just mostly thinking about yourself. And we are by nature. It takes the action of God in our lives. It does in mine for anything to ever change that way. Well, instead, Jesus said, whoever wants to be great, let him be your servant. Whoever wants to be first, let him be your slave. Then he says, just as. Just as. Now this is, I think, verse 28 of Matthew 20. It ends that passage. Just as the Son of Man did not come. Now hear this. To be served, but to serve. And to give his life a ransom for many. When he says just as, then he's telling us, I want you to be there because this is the example I'm setting for you. This is the way I am. And so this lets us know that he leads by example. He doesn't say, do what I say and not as I do, but he says, follow me. I'll show you how to do it. And folks, I am convinced that he made that so simple and obvious that it would take an apostle to misunderstand it, which they did. They argued once again, right at the end, on the Last Supper, after years of patient teaching and example by Jesus. Now, please notice that he never fired them. Be encouraged. What I love is that, when Jesus, Peter, it's so forward, I'm with you. You can count on me. I'll never abandon you. And Jesus knew things about that guy. And he said, you know what, Peter? Tomorrow, before the cock crows twice, you're going to deny me 3 times. Ah. And he did. Now, when you know that your, shall we say, chief employee is going to be the worst thing you ever had other than the betrayer, are you going to stick with him? Jesus did. Now, just for a moment, I've got 1 minute before we take this first break. You think, what do you suppose Jesus knows about you? Too much. I know how you feel, There have been times I've literally argued with God. I was driving along one time, and I was just weeping as I drove because I said, God, it makes no sense that you chose me to do this. I know people that are so much better, so much smarter, and can deliver this so much better than I could. Why did you choose me? I'm a jerk. And folks, there's almost an audible voice of God. Says, yes, you are, Gayle. You're the biggest jerk I know. But I work with jerks. Because there's so many of them. And people will listen to you because they know he's a jerk. And he knows this. So don't ever get discouraged, He knows a lot about you, and he hadn't fired you. And he's not going to. He's not going to say, how many times? I've taught you 1,000,000 times. Have you ever heard that? No, he knows all about you. And he knows a little bit of what's going to happen to you. He can predict it. But even then, he didn't fire Peter. He says, I'm praying for you. Isn't it great to be prayed for by Jesus? Not that you fail not. He knew he was going to fail, but that your faith doesn't fail. That in the middle of all of this, you may be disgusted with yourself, but don't get disgusted with me. I'm on your side. We're going to make it. He led by example. Oh, what a wonderful thing. I'll tell you a story about that after we take our break. Go. Oh, well, you got to say anything to us, Charlie? Okay, so 10:01.